Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, Who Qualifies for Clerical or Outside Sales and Work Comp? I'm Jonathan Schrader, Executive Vice President at Bolton & Company in Pasadena and Southern California Regional Director on IIABCal's Board of Directors. I want to thank IIABCal Associate Member CRC for sponsoring today's webinar. CRC administers the association's commercial earthquake and EPLI insurance programs. For more information on these and other IIABCal products, please visit iiabcal.org. I'm very excited to introduce two experts in the field of workers' compensation insurance in California. With us today are Carrie Kosnick, Quality Assurance Director of the Workers' Compensation Insurance Rating Bureau, and Allison Lightfoot, Classification and Test Audit Analyst for the WCIRB. For any new producers on here, if you're unfamiliar with the WCIRB, they are a tremendous resource, and I'm very glad they're able to join us today. We are recording today's webinar and have muted your phones to eliminate background noises. You can still ask questions throughout the webinar through the question box on your toolbar. All of your questions will be addressed at the end. Carrie and Allison, please take it away.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. Carrie and I are really happy to be here. I'm going to get us started. Today we'll be discussing standard exceptions and determining who qualifies for clerical office and outside salesperson's classifications. We will be reviewing a couple of the changes that were made to the USRP in 2018 for standard exceptions, as well as taking a closer look at the specific restrictions and requirements for these two classes. First, let's take a look at the rules pertaining to standard exceptions. Standard exception assignments are an exception to the general practice of assigning all employees to a single industry classification. Clerical and outside salesperson's classifications are intended to apply only to those employees who are exclusively performing clerical and outside sales duties. These assignments are found in support of most industries and have no specific industry exposure. The USRP has specific requirements and restrictions for these classes. The intent is to keep the standard exceptions rates consistent with exposure and expected loss rates. The idea for having such strict restrictions for these classes is that their exposure should be much lower than, say, an employee working in the warehouse or on a machine shop floor directly working for the business. They shouldn't be having accidents such as working on machinery or forklifts in the shop floor. All right, so let's take a look at Classification 8810 clerical office employees. In addition to employees who perform basic business operations, nearly all businesses have clerical office workers. Generally, clerical office employees are exclusively engaged in office work and have no regular duty of any other nature in service of the employer. So if you imagine a bookkeeper, their duties would be similar across many different industries, with generally the same exposure. So if you look back at a machine shop, or a restaurant, or even a printing operation, many of these businesses have an employee that would be doing accounting, keeping records of the employer, and likely would be working in an office setting. The USRP directs that if a clerical office employee is exposed to any operative hazard of the business, then the entire payroll is assigned to the highest rated class that they're exposed to. So if we look back at possibly a restaurant employee, if they also spend time working in the office, because they work in the restaurant, they would not be allowed to be assigned to Classification 8810. One thing to keep in mind is that supervisors are considered a general inclusion and are specifically included in the classification that describes the employer's business or industry. If we're looking back at that same restaurant employee who potentially works in the office, but also supervises employees, they would not be assignable to Classification 8810 due to their supervisory duties and exposure to the restaurant. Although their duties may seem clerical in nature, because they're a supervisor, they have to be included in that class. Effectively, this enforces the single enterprise application. Another restriction to qualify for this class is that the office employees must be separated by buildings, floors, partitions, railings, or counters. Keep this separation in mind because later we will also review another USRP provision concerning physical separation.
All right, now let's talk about classification 8742. This is another standard exception class and applies to outside salespersons engaged in sales or collection work away from the premises of the employer and public relations work. These employees may also spend a portion of their time performing clerical duties within the office. Just like 8810, the scope for these operations is limited, and an employee that is exposed to any operative hazard of the business no longer qualifies for classification 8742 and are to be assigned to the highest rated classification to which they have exposure. Next, we have a relatively new rule that was effective in 2018. It directs that you cannot divide a single employee's payroll within a single policy period between a standard exception class and any other class unless it's for a single permanent job reassignment. So let's say you have an employee that is working in the machine shop, and at some point during the policy period, they got promoted to a position within the office. This would qualify as a single permanent job reassignment, and you could divide the payroll for this employee for the policy period between 8810 and the machine shop class. However, within that policy period, if the employee maybe decided they didn't like the office so much and wanted to go back into the machine shop, this would be more than one change. It would not be permanent, and it would disqualify them from dividing the payroll. So the payroll would go to the machine shop class for the entire policy period. Another addition was to put some long-standing practices in the USRP in actual writing. So this rule says if you have a single or standard exception employee, they won't be disqualified from that assignment if they're doing the following activities: going to the bank to deposit checks, picking up mail, purchasing office supplies, entering an area exposed to the operative hazard for ingress or egress purposes. These are things that a lot of standard exception employees are doing in real life, and our customer service department often gets questions regarding these duties. So now we have a rule to point to. It should be noted that this isn't making the rule more lenient or expanding the scope of these classes or an invitation to stretch the rule. It's just reinforcing existing practices and reality. If you come across a standard exception employee doing something similar to one of the listed duties but not exactly what's listed, feel free to call our contact center to confirm they still qualify for that assignment.
All right, now that we know a little bit more about standard exceptions, let's take a look at how you classify a business described by standard exception classifications. If the basic business or operation of the employer are assignable to a standard exception, all employees that do not specifically fit the definitions of standard exceptions shall be separately classified. So in this case, we have a single enterprise operation where the insured is providing financial investment and advisory services. If you look on the screen, we have a snapshot of the WCIRB inspection report. If you haven't seen one, this is a portion of the payroll table that would show the classifications assigned to this operation. As you can see, the payroll is primarily allocated to the classes in sales and clerical, but the employees that do not qualify for those classes are assigned to 9015 in this case because they're providing facility maintenance. So many times when the business is otherwise compromised of standard exception employees and employees are doing office facility maintenance, they would be assigned to classification 9015. And if you see on the right side of the payroll table, the basis of assignment is noted. The maintenance employees would be assigned specifically to 9015, whereas the remaining employees are assigned to the standard exception, which is the basic business of this enterprise. So if you remember previously, we discussed the separation requirements for clerical staff. Now we will look at physical separation. These requirements are not the same as the restrictions which we just reviewed for those clerical employees. It is very important to distinguish that physical separation is a defined term in the USRP and is significantly different from the separation requirements applicable to clerical office employees. Physical separation is required when applying the multiple enterprises rule. In this rule, physical separation is achieved by having separate buildings at a location, separate floors of a building, permanent walls not less than 8 feet in height, constructed from standard building materials, such as brick, block, and concrete. If wood or light gauge steel, the walls should be covered with wallboard, plywood, masonite, sheet metal, or other solid materials. Stock shelves, chain link fencing, movable partitions, fixtures, office furniture, or other similar partitions do not constitute physical separation. As you can see, it's much more permanent. An opening in the partition or wall to provide ingress or egress is permissible. Operations subject to separate classifications that are conducted on separate shifts but in a common workspace are considered physically separated, provided the operations are not conducted simultaneously. As you can see, the separation requirements when applying the multiple enterprises rule are much more stringent and consist of permanent building materials. When we look back at the separation requirements for clerical office employees, they do not require permanent walls and can be achieved with partitions, railings, and counters. So it's very important to differentiate the two. Now Carrie's going to go over a couple examples to check in with everyone.
Okay, so let's do a quick knowledge check. So the first scenario, we have a general manager primarily working in the clerical office at a machine shop location, performing a variety of administrative activities. Each day, the general manager tours the machine shop for 15 to 20 minutes, takes note of any safety hazards, equipment in need of repair, and janitorial needs. Can this general manager be assigned to a standard exception class? All right, the answer is no. So the general manager, like Allison mentioned earlier on in our presentation, is a general inclusion because walking through the shop and checking equipment for maintenance or any safety hazards are operations that are necessary and that are done in connection with the machine shop operations. So these aren't any of the duties that we listed earlier about ingress and egress or delivering mail. This is more than that, and it brings the general manager's duties up to a general inclusion. All right, scenario 2. So we have a vice president of sales, and they're retained by a furniture manufacturer to promote sales to furniture retailers and manage a staff of outside sales representatives. This executive works in an office and also accompanies sales representatives when they make presentations to large accounts. The vice president also represents the employer at trade shows. Can the vice president be assigned to classification 8742? You answered yes, you are correct. All of these duties are specifically described by classification 8742. They all fall within the scope of 8742. They're not doing anything in connection with the furniture manufacturing operations. They're not overseeing any shop employees. Everything is sales or public relations related. All right, next I'll throw it back to you, Allison.
All right. Now we're going to go over classifications that specifically include clerical and or outside salespersons in the class phraseology. Some industry classifications specifically include clerical employees and or outside salespersons in the description or phraseology. Typically, this is due to the difficulty in distinguishing between clerical and non-clerical activities for these classifications. If you imagine a computer programming or software development company, many of the duties are very similar. They're conducted in an office setting, working on computers and documents. In these cases, the rates for these classes are calculated including all of the clerical and or sales payroll and loss data associated with these industries. When a class specifically includes clerical office employees, it is not permissible to separately assign clerical office employees to classification 8810, even when the clerical office employees work at a separate location. Additionally, these classes are not restricted by phrases such as all employees and all operations. Now Carrie is going to walk us through what to do when assigning multiple classifications that may or may not include clerical and outside salespersons.
All right, so what do you do when you have multiple classifications that include clerical and or outside sales with some that don't? How do you classify the clerical office? So this would be a multiple enterprises situation. So on the previous slide, if you have any combination of those classes listed and then a class that does not include clerical. Well, you would look at this new rule that was effective in 2018. It's pretty long and wordy, but we're going to go through it piece by piece to kind of walk through the steps and how to decide how the clerical office gets assigned. So the first step is to look at the sum of the payroll, excluding miscellaneous employees for the class or classes that do not include clerical office employees, and compare it to the classes that do include clerical office employees. If the sum of the payroll for the class or classes that do not include clerical office employees generate more payroll, then the clerical office is assigned to 8810. Then what do you do if the situation is reversed? If the class or classes that include clerical office employees generates the same or more payroll than the classes that do not include, the clerical office is assigned to the class that includes clerical office employees. So if you had a physician's office or a dental office or one of those classifications that specifically includes clerical in the phraseology, then that class would apply if it generates the same or more payroll. And this procedure also applies when you're deciding how to classify the outside sales staff if you have classes that also include that staff in the phraseology. So this procedure is similar to the direction in the rules for construction or erection for determining if a yard class applies when you have multiple construction operations, some that include yard and others that do not. So for that industry, we also have a special set of procedures. So this is kind of similar. These were general practices that we had been doing to assign the clerical office, but again, we want to put it in writing in the USRP for a rule to point to that has easy to follow steps. And within the procedures, there's also some examples. And then Allison, back to you, and we'll go over some scenarios.
Okay, as Carrie just described, it can be a complicated rule for assigning multiple classifications that include clerical. So it might always be a good idea to reflect back on the USRP when you are looking at these type of operations. But we're going to go through a couple of knowledge checks to hopefully walk you through and let you see how you would assign these multiple operations. So we're going to look at a couple of scenarios. We have two locations. We have an outpatient clinical, which is assignable to classification 8834 physicians, and this class does include clerical office employees. We have a second location, and they operate a convalescent nursing facility, which is assignable to classification 8829 suffix 2, and this class does not include clerical employees. A clerical office conducting payroll and billing activities in support of both operations is located in a separate area from all other workplaces. What classification applies to the clerical office staff in each scenario below? So let's look at scenario A. The outpatient clinic has $200,000 in payroll, and location 2, the convalescent nursing facility, has $655,000 in payroll. So which class would the clerical office be assigned to in this first scenario? I'll let you guys think about it on your own just for a sec, and then we'll show the answer. All right, let's see. Okay, so in this first scenario, since the convalescent nursing facility is a governing code, meaning it generates the most payroll aside from miscellaneous employees, and this classification does not include clerical office employees in phraseology, the clerical employees would be assigned to classification 8810. All right, let's look at scenario B. So in this case, the outpatient clinic has $750,000, and location 2, the convalescent nursing facility, has $655,000 in payroll. So in this case, which classification would be assigned for the clerical office employees? I'll let you guys think about it for another minute. All right, let's see it. Okay, so for this second scenario, since classification 8834, the outpatient facility, is the governing classification, and this class does include clerical employees in the phraseology, the clerical office employees would be assigned to classification 8834. It's important to look at the payroll because these can shift year by year. So knowing the rule is good and reflecting back in the USRP is definitely helpful. So now Carrie's going to walk through a couple more examples of these procedures to hopefully add to that.
All right, similar exercise here. We're going to look at two more scenarios. This time we have a nonprofit social services agency, which are always fun to classify. But in this situation, we just have a food bank assignable to classification 8006 for grocery stores. And we have a daycare assignable to 9059 for daycare centers. And then a dental clinic assignable to classification 8839. And as you can see, based on the phraseologies for those three classes, 8839 is the only one that includes clerical office employees. So we have a clerical office conducting payroll and admin work for all of the operations in an area that's separate from all the other workplaces. So what classification applies to the clerical staff in scenario C? We have the food bank payroll, daycare payroll, and the dental clinic payroll. So take a minute just to look at it, think back on the steps we talked about earlier and the last exercise we did. All right, so for scenario C, the clerical employees would be assigned to 8810 because the combination of the food bank payroll and the daycare payroll generates more payroll than the dental clinic. And then scenario D, do some quick math, you can see this one would be assigned to classification 8839 for the dental clinic because this case, the combination of the food bank and daycare is less than the dental clinic. All right, now we'll go over some WCIRB resources. So as always, we have our website, which has a wealth of information. WCIRB.com. There you can find all our publications and filings, including the USRP. If you need to refer back to any of the rules we discussed, you can go straight to the USRP there. I have the PDF of the USRP open on my desktop all day and just Control F and search whatever I need. Or we have our class search tool in the Learning Center. We have e-newsletters, news and notes, wire stories, our Comp Essentials on-demand courses, and information on upcoming webinars and even past webinars that you can access. And especially for Comp Essentials, we have some really valuable courses on there. Again, they're on-demand online courses, and they're really useful for all experience and skill levels within the insurance industry. The different courses we have available are Experience Rating Fundamentals, Classification Basics, Ownership and Experience Rating, and then soon we'll have a course that's available about the workers' comp system and how the WCIRB plays a role in that whole insurance industry and workers' comp system. So you can take these at your own pace. If you have a group, you can get a group of people to do it. For IIABCal members, if you purchase your course through the IIABCal website, you can get a 10% discount. And these courses will all give you 5 continuing education credits. And then if you, like I said, there's also a discount for groups. And I think it's for 30 or more. All right, so now we'll open it up for questions. If you have questions, you can just insert them in the chat box and we'll take a look and see if we can address any broadly to the group.
Okay, so it looks like we did have one question regarding how many times an employee can change classifications from a clerical office to another classification in a policy period. So the rule is strictly that the employee can have a permanent job change within a policy period. So it's pretty much that one-time job change. Possibly the machine shop manager got promoted to be an office manager and is only working in the office, not supervising any staff on the shop floor. Then they would be qualified for that class 8810, but they can't flip-flop back and forth between policy periods.
So the rule says one time within a policy period. All right, looks like we have another question. What if you have designers and pattern makers for a clothing manufacturer? If they're handling samples, can they still qualify for classification 8810? So this, most sample makers or most designers, clothing designers and pattern makers, a lot of the way that's done now is on computers using CAD design systems. And so a lot of that is just computer office work. And if they are separate from the other work areas of the clothing manufacturer, so if they're separate from the sample making room and separate from the warehouse, then they can still qualify for classification 8810. If there are samples and, swatches of clothing or fabric around their work area, that's not necessarily going to disqualify them from 8810. They're still doing clerical work and they're still separate from the sample making. They're allowed to have samples around them and look at them as in connection with their design and pattern making work. But as long as they're not, manufacturing clothing or handling any quality control inspection in the warehouse, then they can still qualify for 8810.
So we are having a lot of questions about the presentation being available, and this will be available to everyone. I believe they'll be posting it on the IIABCal website, and that will be available to everyone. Let's see what else we have going on.
All right, we have another question about the classes that include clerical and outside sales. So in the examples before, we had 2 classes that did not include and 1 class that included. The question is, when you have 2 classes that include clerical or outside sales and 1 that doesn't, how do you determine which of the 2 classifications that include clerical to use for the office? So in that situation, you would use the larger, whichever one generates the more payroll. So if you had, in that last example, a dental office and a physician's office and then the daycare. If the physician's payroll was larger than the dental, then the clerical office would be assigned to 8834.
We did have another question about if an employee spent a percentage of time or had a minor percentage of time outside of the office or any minor exposure in the operative hazard of the business, would they still be allowable in classification 8810? So the rule is that they have to be 100% in the office. So if there's a portion of time that's spent with working outside of the office, unless it's in like a sales capacity, they would be classified in that 8742. But if they're involved in the business operations of the employer, then they would not be allowable in classification 8810. It's 100%.
And we tried to minimize the gray area for that by adding that rule about the depositing checks at the bank or picking up mail, delivering paychecks in the office, or the ingress or egress. So if it's not any of those things and it's something they're leaving the office that's in connection with the general business operations, then you need to look at that a little bit more closely and refer back to the rule.
All right, and I think we're about running out of time, so I think we're going to pass it back to Jonathan, and we'll try and go over any of the other questions that we had come in. We had a lot of participants today, so we really appreciate your guys' attention and your questions. Hopefully we'll be able to get back, send some feedback on the other questions that we weren't able to get to, but we really appreciate everyone joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie and Allison. That was outstanding. Like you mentioned, that with so many folks signed up for this particular webinar, you are not alone in wanting clarity over this particular subject. So thank you for sharing your information with us. I also want to thank CRC for sponsoring today's session. WCIRB and IIABCal are holding a series of webinars this year as part of our Workers' Comp Education Path. If you want more information on these and other upcoming webinars, visit iiabcal.org. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you for participating. Have a great day.